So what legacy does Hannah model for us? If we're going to be able to identify the legacy that Hannah left, we have to understand a bit of her background. According to the text, she's one of two wives of Elkanah. Every year, Elkanah led his wives to travel to Shiloh, the place of worship for all of Israel, so that they might worship God there. And during the time in which they were at Shiloh, Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah, would continually pick and prod at Hannah because of her inability to have children. It would seem that Peninnah lorded over Hannah with the fact that she was unable to have children while Peninnah was able to have many. I can only imagine what Peninnah would say to Hannah that would cause Hannah not to eat or drink, but to break down and cry. I can see Hannah there year after year going to worship God in the midst of her worship, being harassed and bullied by Peninnah so that the anguish she felt at being barren became overwhelming. It would seem her inability to have children was truly a trial and tribulation. And Peninnah and her hurtful words were just a trial and tribulation on top of the trial she was already facing. But here's the first point of this message this morning with regards to the legacy of Hannah. The text says that year after year, whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Did y'all catch it? Despite Hannah's trials and tribulations, and knowing that she would be picked on just as she always was, she still, year after year, went up to the house of the Lord to worship. But for Hannah, going to the house of the Lord subjected her to the harsh reality of her situation every time she went. Yet, she would still go, because her intention was to worship God despite her trials. The legacy that Hannah leaves for the future generations is persistence in her faith, despite the trials that she would face. Surely Hannah knew that she would be unable to dodge Peninnah and her hatefulness. But what Hannah determines is what is important is pushing through to be in God's presence in the midst of her trial. Lord have mercy. What a world it would be if folks decided that despite the hardship of life, despite the difficulty that they face, despite the hatefulness of others, that they would not let anything stand in the way of worshiping God. That although they face issues that seem insurmountable, they'll continue to focus on the goodness and graciousness and the hope that exists in God Almighty. I hear someone saying, well, preacher, persistence in trials is easier said than done. And I hear you. But here's the thing that I know for sure about tribulations. Jesus said, in this life, you will have tribulations. This means that no matter what, there will always be something. If it ain't one thing, it will surely be another. You'll have an issue on your job. You might have an issue in your house. You might have an issue with your kids. You might have an issue with your friends. You might have an issue with your car. But there's always seems to be something going on. And when these trials come, because they will come, you are always quick to give up. You will be overcome by the issues of life. And as a byproduct, model for those behind you that trials cannot be overcome. Hannah persists in her faith with the hope that although she is facing some big issues, God sees her pain and will give her what she needs to push through. Somebody made it to the house of the Lord this morning after having pushed through some trials and tribulations. Couldn't find the right thing to wear, got in an argument with one of your family members, jumped in the car and realized your gas tank was empty and you only got a few dollars in your car. Somebody had a hard week. The doctor gave a bad prognosis, but you pressed this morning anyway. I stand to tell you that the trials of life are designed to be obstacles to your accessing the hope that exists in true relationship with God. You must persist in the midst of your trials. Listen, last weekend, right? My niece, Nevaeh, came to visit with us from Salisbury. And her and Kendall were playing with toys. They had this ball that they kept picking up. They kept just throwing it down. It seemed like they were fascinated not with throwing the ball up, but what would happen when they threw it up. They just kept bouncing the ball. Over and over again, they bouncing the ball. And eventually I see Kendall go over and Kendall picks up a block. And she throws the block down. And the block doesn't bounce back up. And I began to think about what I had seen when I was reading the story of Hannah. And considering that she persisted despite her trials. Many of us are thrown down by our trials and our tribulations. Sometimes the trials are light and other times they are really hard. But either way, God is calling us to respond to our trials just like the ball. No matter how light or how hard the ball gets thrown down, it always bounces back up. But if you don't persist, you're like the block that just laid there. And ultimately, you will be blocking the blessing that exists in the trial that you face. If you have declared yourself to be a disciple, then you are a ball and not the block. And the difference between the ball and the block is what they're made of. As disciples, you are made of truth, that all things work together for the good of them that love God and are called according to his purpose. You're made of truth, that although we will face tribulation, we can be of good cheer. For Jesus overcome the world. Although we're made of truth that we can't grow weary of well-doing, because in due season we will reap if we faint not. We're made of truth that we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. If you're going to create lasting legacies, you've got to persist in your faith despite your trial.